The shadows have stories to tell, but not everyone dares to listen. They whisper in the dead of night, waiting for someone brave enough to hear them. The sky bled orange as the sun dipped behind the towering pines, casting long shadows over the damp forest floor. 4 friends, Ethan, Claire, Mark, and Rachel, were setting up camp in a secluded clearing miles away from civilization. The crisp scent of pine needles and damp earth filled the air as they pitched their tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what they hoped would be a weekend of adventure and relaxation. Ethan, the self-proclaimed outdoorsman of the group, poked at the fire with a stick. "This is perfect. No cell service, no responsibilities, just us and nature." Claire, his girlfriend, stretched her arms and smiled. "As long as no bears show up, I'm good." Mark scoffed. "Bears are the least of our worries. Have you ever heard of the stories about people disappearing in these woods? Whole search parties have gone in and never come back." Rachel, rolling her eyes, threw a marshmallow at him. "Don't start with your ghost stories, Mark. I actually want to sleep tonight." They laughed and continued their light-hearted banter as the fire crackled and the darkness thickened around them. The night was peaceful, save for the occasional hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. But then, just as they were winding down for the night, a sound drifted through the trees. A whistle. It was faint, distant, almost like a song carried on the wind. The friends paused, exchanging glances. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, though his voice held a note of uncertainty. The whistle came again, this time a little closer. The tune was eerily familiar, but none of them could place it. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves overhead. Unnerved but unwilling to admit it, they laughed it off and retreated into their tents. But the whistling didn't stop. That night, Rachel lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling of her tent. Every now and then, the whistle would return, closer, clearer. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate, following a pattern, a tune. And then her heart nearly stopped. It whistled her name. The voice was unmistakable. It mimicked her own voice, whistling her name with perfect clarity. Rachel bolted upright, her breath shallow. She unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned low, casting eerie shadows around the camp. The trees swayed, their branches whispering secrets, but there was no one there. No sign of the whistler. She shut her eyes and willed herself to sleep. The next morning, Rachel told the others what she had heard, but none of them had experienced the same thing. "It was probably a dream," Claire offered. Mark chuckled. "Or a bird. Some of them can mimic sounds, you know." Ethan, however, frowned. "Let's just keep an eye out." They spent the day hiking, swimming in a nearby lake, and forgetting about the eerie events of the night before. But as dusk fell, an uneasy feeling settled over the camp, and as they sat around the fire, it returned, the whistling. This time it was unmistakably human. It came from deep in the woods, weaving between the trees, floating through the night air. The tune was identical to the one from the night before, soft, slow, and haunting. Then, just as the group was trying to convince themselves it was nothing, the whistling changed. It was whistling Claire's name. Claire's breath hitched. "That's not the wind." "No, it's not," Ethan admitted, standing up and grabbing the flashlight. "I don't like this. We should pack up and leave in the morning." Mark, ever the skeptic, grinned. "What? Are you scared? Maybe I should whistle back and see if it answers." "Don't," Rachel snapped. "Just don't." But it was too late. Mark puckered his lips and whistled the same eerie tune back into the trees. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence blanketed the forest. Then, the whistle came back, from right behind him. Mark spun around, the blood draining from his face. The others gasped as the firelight flickered, illuminating the trees behind them. Nothing was there. "We're leaving tomorrow," Ethan said firmly, "first thing in the morning." But morning would be too late. That night, Rachel barely slept. Every time she drifted off, she was jolted awake by the feeling of being watched. The whistling had stopped, but somehow the silence was worse. A twig snapped outside her tent. Her heart pounded. She held her breath, listening. Another snap. Then a whisper. No, not a whisper. A whistle so quiet it was almost inside her tent. And then a voice, distorted and wrong, murmured just outside the thin fabric. "Rachel!" She screamed. The others rushed out of their tents, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Rachel was trembling, pointing at her tent. It was right there. It said my name. The group turned their lights towards the trees, but nothing moved. The whistling was gone. "That's it," Ethan said. "We're leaving now." They hurried to pack their things, adrenaline pumping through their veins, but as they stuffed their gear into their backpacks, something dawned on them. Mark was missing. They called his name, their voices panicked and desperate. They searched the camp, the surrounding trees, the paths leading to the lake. He was gone. Then, from deep in the woods, they heard it. A whistle. Not just any whistle. Mark's whistle. "He's alive!" Claire gasped, her relief short-lived as Ethan grabbed her wrist. "No," he said, his voice tight. "That's not Mark." The whistle came again, closer now, circling them. The trees seemed to loom taller, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. Panic surged through them. Rachel turned and ran. The others followed, tearing through the underbrush, branches slashing at their skin. Behind them, the whistle followed, impossibly fast, impossibly close. Then, suddenly, the whistling stopped. They reached their car, panting and shaking. They didn't look back as Ethan fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and sped away. Days passed. The police searched the woods but found no trace of Mark. No footprints, no belongings, nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. 1 week later, Rachel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep elusive. The guilt of leaving Mark behind weighed heavy on her. The last thing she had heard of him was that whistle. Then, just as she was finally drifting off, she heard it. A whistle. Outside her window. Soft. Familiar. Mark's whistle. And then, just as she sat up in bed, frozen in fear, it mimicked her voice once more. It whistled her name. The night swallowed her scream. The first thing Mia did when they reached the clearing was take a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. This was exactly what she needed, a weekend away from the stress of work, deadlines, and the constant buzzing of her phone. Just the quiet, the trees, and her best friends. "It's perfect," she said, dropping her heavy backpack onto the soft forest floor. "Damn right it is," Jake replied, wiping sweat off his brow. "Now, let's get the tents up before we lose daylight." The group, Mia, Jake, Sarah, and Adam, had been planning this camping trip for months. They had chosen a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites where weekend warriors and noisy families always gathered. This was their adventure, their escape. As the sun began to set, their campsite took shape. The tents were pitched, a fire crackled in the pit, and the smell of roasting marshmallows mixed with the pine-scented air. Laughter filled the clearing as they reminisced about old times and shared stories. "This is exactly what we needed," Sarah said, leaning against Mia. "No work, no responsibilities, just us and nature." Adam pulled out his phone. "We need a picture to mark the occasion. Group photo?" They gathered around the fire, squishing in close. Adam extended his arm, angled the phone, and snapped the shot. Later, as the fire died down and they settled into their tents, Mia checked her phone. They had no service, but that didn't matter. She opened the photo Adam had taken, smiling at their happy faces, until she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Between her and Jake sat a fifth figure. It was pale, wide-eyed, and its mouth was slightly open, as if caught mid-breath. The figure's dark, hollow gaze seemed to bore directly into her. Its expression was neither smiling nor frowning, just vacant. Her breath hitched. She quickly sat up and unzipped her tent. "Guys," she called out in a shaky whisper. "Guys, wake up," Sarah grumbled from her tent. "What is it?" Mia didn't answer. She ran to Adam's tent and yanked the zipper down. "What the hell?" Adam groaned, shielding his eyes from Mia's flashlight. "Look at the picture." Her voice trembled as she thrust the phone toward him. He squinted at the screen, his drowsiness evaporating in an instant. "Who the hell is that?" By now, Jake and Sarah had emerged from their tents. "What's going on?" Jake asked, rubbing his eyes. Mia turned the phone so they could see. Silence settled over them as they stared at the pale figure wedged between them in the photo. That wasn't there when we took it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right?" "Of course not," Jake snapped, looking around the campsite. "It's a glitch or something, maybe a trick of the light." Adam swallowed hard. "Then why does it look like it's sitting right next to us?" Nobody had an answer. They decided after much arguing to stay close together for the night. Jake and Adam stoked the fire while the girls wrapped themselves in blankets, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over them. "Maybe it's just a weird trick of the camera," Sarah suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. Mia kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see something or someone watching them. "Then why do I feel like we're not alone?" A branch snapped in the distance. They all froze. The night was still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the soft crackle of the fire. Then came another sound, closer this time, a slow, deliberate shuffling. Sarah whimpered. Adam gripped his flashlight, clicking it on and sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Jake grabbed a log from the fire, holding it like a weapon. "If someone's messing with us, this isn't funny." Silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Shallow. Ragged. Mia's blood ran cold. The sound wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from behind them. She turned slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. The fire cast flickering shadows across the campsite, but in the dim light, she could just make out a shape. Someone was sitting in the empty camping chair by the fire, pale, wide-eyed, mouth slightly open. Mia screamed. The others whipped around, their eyes landing on the figure. For a fraction of a second, they all saw it, sitting perfectly still, watching them. Then it was gone. The chair was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. Jake swore under his breath. "Nope. Nope. We're leaving." "No arguments here," Adam said, already grabbing his backpack. They didn't bother packing properly. They threw their things together haphazardly, extinguished the fire, and grabbed their flashlights. The hike back to the car would take at least an hour, but none of them cared. They just needed to leave. As they trudged through the dark forest, Mia felt it again, that presence, lingering just beyond the edges of their light. She looked over her shoulder. A pair of wide eyes stared back from the darkness. She choked on a scream and broke into a run, the others following without question. Their hurried footsteps crashed through the underbrush, the once familiar trail now a terrifying gauntlet of shifting shadows and imagined horrors. When they finally reached the car, Adam fumbled with the keys, cursing under his breath. The moment the doors unlocked, they threw themselves inside and slammed the doors shut. Mia dared one last glance at the tree line. The figure stood just beyond the reach of their headlights, watching. They sped away, not looking back. By the time they reached town, exhaustion overtook them, but none of them could shake the feeling that something had followed them back. That night in her apartment, Mia hesitated before checking her phone again. With a deep breath, she opened the photo one more time. The figure was still there, only now it was smiling. The fire crackled, sending up embers into the night sky, where the stars shone with an unnatural brilliance. The Woods family, Daniel, his wife Claire, and their teenage daughter Sophie, sat around their own campfire, enjoying the silence of the forest. It was their first camping trip in years, an attempt to rekindle old traditions after life had pulled them in different directions. It was Sophie who noticed it first. "Hey, do you guys see that? Over there, past the trees." Daniel followed her gaze and saw a faint flickering glow in the distance. Another campsite not far from theirs, the fire still burning. "Maybe some other campers," Claire suggested, shrugging. "Weird though, why is their fire still going this late?" "No one's making noise." Curiosity gnawed at them. Leaving their own site behind, they walked cautiously toward the other camp, flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they approached, their unease deepened. The tents were still pitched, but they sagged as if abandoned in haste. A half-eaten meal rested on a foldable table, plates and utensils scattered. A small pot of soup simmered over the fire, but no one was there to tend to it. There were no voices, no laughter, no presence of life. "This is giving me the creeps," Sophie muttered, stepping closer to the campfire. "Where are the people?" Daniel inspected the area. No footprints in the dirt, no signs of struggle. Just an empty, lived-in space as if the campers had simply vanished. Claire checked inside the nearest tent and gasped. "Their bags, their clothes, it's all still here. But no people." Daniel frowned. "Something's off. Maybe they went for a night hike." "Then why leave the food?" Sophie countered. They called out, their voices echoing through the trees. No response. The silence was suffocating. "We should head back to our campsite," Claire said. "Maybe we can report this to a ranger in the morning." Reluctantly, they turned back, leaving the eerie scene behind. But even as they walked away, the abandoned campsite seemed to cling to their thoughts, unsettling and strange. Back at their own site, they settled into their tents. The night stretched on, and though exhaustion weighed on them, sleep didn't come easily. Then, just before dawn, Sophie woke up with a start. Something was wrong. She crawled out of her tent, rubbing her eyes, and froze. The fire was out. The chairs, the tent, the cooler, gone. In their place stood the abandoned campsite. Her breath hitched. "Mom? Dad?" Claire and Daniel stumbled out of their tent, their faces etched with confusion. "Where the hell is our stuff?" Daniel demanded, looking around frantically. The eerie campsite had replaced their own, exactly as they had left it last night. The same slumped tents, the same half-eaten meal, the same untouched belongings of people who were no longer here. Panic set in. "This isn't right," Claire whispered. "We need to go. Now." They grabbed what little they had on them, flashlights, a pocket knife, Sophie's phone. But there was no signal. The dirt path they had taken into the forest seemed distorted, unfamiliar. As they hurried through the trees, their surroundings felt different, as if the forest had shifted overnight. The air was thick with something oppressive, something unseen pressing against them. The further they walked, the more the trees looked the same, the path looping back in ways that made no sense. Sophie checked her phone again. Still no service, but there was something else. Her phone's clock was frozen. 3:47 a.m. It had been 3:47 a.m. for what felt like hours. Her stomach twisted. "Dad, I think we're stuck." Daniel didn't want to believe it. He marched ahead, trying different paths, but they all led back to the same place. The abandoned campsite. The sun never rose. The air remained heavy, pressing down on them like an unseen force, warping time and space around them. No matter what they did, they couldn't escape. Then came the whispers, soft at first, then growing louder. A chorus of voices just beyond the trees, murmuring unintelligible words, sometimes laughing, sometimes sobbing. Claire clutched Sophie's arm. "Daniel, what do we do?" He had no answer. Then, through the trees, shadows flickered. Figures moved, just beyond their vision, and a realization settled in. The campers who had been here before hadn't left. They were still here, and now so were they. Jacob had always been drawn to the solitude of the forest. It wasn't just the crisp air or the endless stretch of towering pines. It was the quiet, the way the world seemed to hush itself, the only sounds being the wind through the leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. So, when he found a remote campsite deep within Black Hollow Woods, he knew he had found his perfect escape. He set up his tent just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that flickered between the trees. A fire crackled before him, its glow painting the surrounding trunks in wavering gold. He took a deep breath, feeling truly alone, just the way he liked it. As he rummaged through his backpack for a book to read, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. Beneath his gear, half buried in the dirt near the fire pit, was a small, tattered journal. The cover was worn, its edges frayed, and the leather was cracked with age. Curious, he wiped away the grime and flipped it open. The first page contained only a name, scrawled in shaky handwriting: Elliot Graves. Jacob turned the page, his interest piqued. The ink inside was smudged in places, but the writing was legible enough. It was a journal, a personal account of someone's time in the woods. He skimmed through the entries, growing increasingly uneasy. September 17th. I saw it again today. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, just a shadow shifting between the trees. But it's real. I know it is. It watches me. Every night I hear it whispering just outside my tent. September 18th. I tried leaving. I swear I did. But no matter how far I go, the trees bring me back here. It won't let me leave. The thing that watches, it knows me now. It knows my name. September 19th. I don't think I'll make it through tonight. It's closer than ever. I can hear it breathing when I try to sleep. It doesn't just watch, it speaks. It told me. The writing stopped abruptly. Jacob flipped through the remaining pages, his heart pounding. Every single one was blank. A chill crept up his spine as he realized something unsettling. The last sentence had ended mid-thought, as if Elliot had been interrupted. And that night was dated almost exactly 1 year ago. Jacob exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It was probably a prank. Maybe some local kids trying to scare campers. It had to be. Still, as he stared into the fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about the woods now, that they had changed the moment he opened that book. That night, as he lay in his tent, the silence felt heavier than before. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures, crickets, distant owls, had gone eerily still. Jacob told himself it was his imagination, that he had let the journal get to him. Then he heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, a step, then another, and another. Something was pacing outside his tent. His breath caught in his throat. He reached for the flashlight beside him, gripping it so tightly his fingers ached. He wanted to call out, to say something, anything. But fear kept him frozen. Then the whispering began. It was faint at first, like wind filtering through the trees. But soon the words became clear, rasping and hollow, carried on the night air. "It told me. It told me. It told me." Jacob's stomach twisted. It was finishing the sentence from the journal. "It told me your name, Jacob." His blood turned to ice. He hadn't said his name aloud since he arrived. The fire crackled, sending up tiny embers that vanished into the vast night sky. The 6 friends, Liam, Sarah, Jonah, Emily, Marcus, and Vanessa, huddled around the glow, their faces flickering between shadow and warmth. Deep in the Appalachia, on wilderness, miles from the nearest town, they had come seeking adventure, an escape from their screens and routines. "This place is perfect," Jonah said, stretching his arms behind his head. "No cell service, no distractions, just us and the wild. And maybe some bears," Vanessa added with a smirk. Liam chuckled. "Relax, Ness. As long as we store the food properly, we'll be fine." The night was calm, the forest alive with chirping crickets and rustling leaves. The group swapped stories, laughed, and sipped from their flasks until the flames died down to glowing embers. One by one, they retired to their tents, letting sleep take them under the vast, star-speckled sky. But the peace did not last. Sometime in the deep hours of the night, Marcus awoke to the sound of his name drifting through the trees. "Marcus." It was a whisper, faint but clear. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and listened. The fire pit was just a heap of dull coals now, barely casting any light. The forest beyond was a sea of darkness. "Marcus, come here." His heart pounded. The voice was familiar, unmistakably Jonah's, but something about it was off. It was as though Jonah were calling from far away, yet the voice carried as if right beside his ear. Marcus unzipped his tent and peeked out. The camp was still. The other tents were zipped shut, their occupants motionless inside. He turned toward the trees, where the voice had come from. "Jonah," he whispered, his breath fogging in the cool air. Silence. Marcus hesitated, his gut churning. The sensible part of his brain told him to wake the others, but another part, a curious, irrational part, urged him to step forward, just to check. He took a single step toward the tree line, then another. Something rustled in the undergrowth. He froze. Then, from behind him, inside the tent beside his, Jonah let out a deep, steady snore. Marcus's blood turned to ice. He bolted back into his tent and zipped it shut, his pulse hammering. He lay awake for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, listening. The voice did not return. Eventually, exhaustion took him, and he drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, Marcus said nothing about the voice. He convinced himself he'd imagined it, some half-dream brought on by exhaustion. The day passed without incident. The group hiked along a winding trail, taking in the towering trees and the endless stretch of wilderness. They laughed, snapped pictures, and for a time, Marcus almost forgot about the night before. But when night fell and they gathered once more around the fire, the unease crept back into his bones. Sarah was the first to retire, then Vanessa, then Jonah. Marcus lingered by the fire until Liam and Emily followed suit. Again, he lay in his tent, staring at the fabric ceiling, waiting. And then, "Emily, come here." Marcus stiffened. The whisper was clear as day. His stomach twisted as he heard the soft rustling of a zipper, Emily's tent opening. "Emily, don't," Marcus hissed, sitting up. But her shadow was already moving toward the trees, her posture slack, as if in a trance. Marcus scrambled out of his tent, grabbing her wrist. "Emily!" He shook her hard. "What are you doing?" She blinked, dazed. "Jonah, he was calling me. He said he needed help." Marcus turned. Jonah's tent was zipped shut, a faint snore coming from inside. The blood drained from Emily's face as she realized what had almost happened. They ran back to their tents without another word. They all heard the voices. It started with Vanessa, then Jonah, then Sarah. Each called from the forest, luring them one by one. "Liam, it's me. I'm lost. Please help." "Marcus, I'm hurt. Please come." "Sarah, don't leave me alone out here." But none of them moved this time. Huddled together in the center of camp, their flashlights gripped in shaking hands, they listened as the voices circled them. The whispers slithered between the trees, growing more insistent. "Come to me. Why won't you help? We're waiting. Let us in." Then the voices changed. They overlapped, distorting, stretching into something inhuman. The voices became layered, the words blending into garbled, unnatural sounds. And then, silence. The night pressed against them, thick and suffocating. A single long breath exhaled behind them. They spun around, flashing their lights wildly, but there was nothing there. Just the forest, empty and vast. "We leave at sunrise," Liam whispered. "No matter what." The minutes crawled by. None of them dared to sleep. The forest remained deathly quiet, the presence lurking just beyond sight, watching. When dawn finally bled into the sky, they wasted no time. They packed in silence, their hands shaking, their skin clammy with sweat. As they set off down the trail, the trees felt taller, their shadows longer, as if the forest itself stretched to keep them within. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air became. Every step felt like trudging through water. Then Vanessa gasped. "Where's the trail?" The familiar dirt path had vanished. In its place, nothing but thick undergrowth. "No," Liam whispered. "We didn't turn off. We followed it, exactly." Then, from ahead, Sarah's voice called. "This way, I found it." Sarah's breath hitched. That wasn't me." They turned and ran. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to move, had to escape the suffocating pull of the voices. The whispers followed them, growing louder, shifting, multiplying. They came from all directions, filling their ears, crawling under their skin. "Come back. You belong to us now." Jonah tripped and Marcus yanked him to his feet. "Keep running." And then, sunlight. They burst through the tree line, gasping, collapsing onto solid asphalt. Their car sat just a few feet away, exactly where they had left it. The forest behind them was still, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. They climbed into the car, hearts still pounding, and sped away without looking back. None of them spoke of that night, not at first. Days passed, then weeks. They returned to their lives, but something had changed. Sometimes in the dead of night, they would wake to whispers outside their windows, calling their names. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden hue over the serene landscape of Whispering Pines National Park. The lake, a mirror of glassy stillness, reflected the towering evergreens and the faint blush of the evening sky. It was the kind of place that made you forget the chaos of the world, a sanctuary where time seemed to slow down. For Emma, it was the perfect escape. She had been hiking for hours, her boots crunching against the gravel path, her backpack heavy with supplies. The campsite she had chosen was secluded, far from the main trails and the chatter of other campers. She wanted solitude, a chance to clear her head after months of stress and sleepless nights. The lake, with its tranquil beauty, seemed like the ideal spot to find peace. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, Emma set up her tent, gathered firewood, and prepared a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The air was cool, and the faint chirping of crickets filled the silence. She sat by the fire, staring into the flames, letting her thoughts drift. But no matter how hard she tried to relax, a nagging unease lingered in the back of her mind. When the fire died down, Emma decided to wash up before bed. She grabbed her towel and a small bottle of soap, making her way to the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface smooth and unbroken. She knelt on the rocky shore, cupping the cool water in her hands and splashing it on her face. The sensation was refreshing, and for a moment she felt a sense of calm. Then she saw it. As she leaned closer to the water, her reflection stared back at her. But something was off. Her reflection was smiling, a wide, almost unnerving grin. Emma froze, her heart pounding. She wasn't smiling. In fact, she hadn't smiled in days. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the reflection remained unchanged. "What the?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She leaned back, her hands gripping the edge of the shore. Her reflection didn't move with her. It stayed where it was, its smile growing wider, its eyes locking onto hers. Emma's breath quickened and she scrambled to her feet, stumbling backward. The reflection tilted its head as if amused by her reaction, and then slowly faded into the darkness of the water. Emma stood there, her chest heaving, her mind racing. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down she knew it wasn't. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. The next morning, Emma woke to the sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustling of leaves. The events of the previous night felt like a distant dream, but the memory of the reflection lingered in her mind. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was nothing. She had come here to relax, not to dwell on strange occurrences. She spent the day exploring the area, hiking along the trails and taking in the breathtaking views. The park was even more beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight filtering through the trees and the lake sparkling like a gem. But no matter how much she tried to enjoy herself, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the sun began to set, Emma returned to her campsite. She built a fire and cooked dinner, trying to distract herself with the mundane tasks of camping. But as the sky darkened, her unease grew. She couldn't stop thinking about the reflection in the lake. When it was time to wash up, she hesitated. The thought of going back to the water's edge filled her with dread, but she couldn't avoid it forever. She grabbed her towel and soap, forcing herself to approach the lake. The water was calm, just as it had been the night before. Emma knelt on the shore, her hands trembling as she cupped the water. She splashed it on her face, her eyes darting to the surface. Her reflection stared back at her, but this time it was normal. No smile, no strange movements, just her own tired face. She let out a sigh of relief, laughing at herself for being so paranoid. "It was just my imagination," she muttered, shaking her head. But as she stood to leave, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A ripple in the water, as if something had moved just beneath the surface. She turned, her heart racing, but the lake was still. She told herself it was just a fish, but the unease returned, stronger than before. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in her tent, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the distance. But there was another sound, faint and almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic splashing, like something moving in the water. She sat up, her breath shallow, her ears straining to hear. The sound grew louder, closer. She grabbed her flashlight, her hands shaking as she unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The campsite was bathed in moonlight, the lake shimmering in the distance. The splashing sound was coming from the water. Emma's instincts screamed at her to stay put, to lock herself in the tent and wait for morning. But something compelled her to move forward, to investigate. She walked toward the lake, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The splashing stopped as she approached, and the lake fell silent. She stood at the edge of the water, her flashlight shining across the surface. The beam caught something, a figure just beneath the water. It was humanoid, its features blurred and distorted. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to rise, breaking the surface with a slow, deliberate movement. It was her. The figure looked exactly like her, but its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and translucent. It smiled, the same unnerving grin she had seen in her reflection. Emma stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. The beam rolled across the ground, casting eerie shadows as the figure stepped out of the water. What are you?" Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. "I'm you," it said, its voice a distorted echo of her own. "The part of you that you've been trying to ignore." Emma's mind raced, her thoughts a jumbled mess. "This isn't real," she said, shaking her head. "This can't be real." The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnatural. "Oh, it's real," it said. "You've been running from yourself for so long, Emma, but you can't run forever." Emma's legs gave out, and she fell to the ground, her eyes wide with terror. The figure loomed over her, its hollow eyes staring into her soul. "You've been so afraid," it said. "Afraid of failure, afraid of being alone, afraid of facing the truth. But you don't have to be afraid anymore." Emma's vision blurred, her mind overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Memories she had buried, fears she had ignored, regrets she had tried to forget, they all came rushing back. She felt a tear roll down her cheek as the figure knelt beside her, its cold hand brushing against her face. "It's time to stop running," it whispered. "It's time to face yourself." When Emma woke the next morning, she was lying on the shore of the lake, the sun shining brightly overhead. She sat up, her head pounding, her body aching. The events of the night felt like a nightmare, but the memory was vivid, too real to dismiss. She looked at the lake, its surface calm and undisturbed. There was no sign of the figure, no trace of what had happened. But something had changed. She felt different, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Over the next few days, Emma stayed at the campsite, spending her time reflecting on her life. She thought about the choices she had made, the fears that had held her back, the parts of herself she had tried to ignore. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity. When it was time to leave, Emma packed up her tent and slung her backpack over her shoulders. She took one last look at the lake, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky. She smiled, a genuine smile, and for a moment she thought she saw her reflection smile back. But this time it wasn't unnerving. It was comforting. As she walked away from the lake, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't have all the answers, and she knew there would still be challenges ahead. But she was ready to face them, ready to stop running from herself. The reflection in the lake had shown her the truth, and for that, she was grateful. Months later, Emma returned to Whispering Pines National Park. She had been thinking about the lake ever since she left, and she felt drawn to it, as if it held a piece of her soul. This time, she wasn't running from anything. She was simply returning to a place that had changed her life. As she stood at the edge of the lake, the sun setting behind the trees, she felt a sense of calm. The water was still, its surface a perfect mirror. She knelt on the shore, her reflection staring back at her. It was just her. No strange smiles, no distorted figures. Just Emma. She smiled, and her reflection smiled back. For the first time in a long time, she felt whole. The forest was alive with sound. The rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional scurrying of small creatures through the underbrush. It was a symphony of nature, a comforting reminder that the world was still vibrant and full of life. But that was before the silence. It was the third night of their camping trip, and the group of friends had settled into a routine. They had chosen this remote part of the forest specifically for its seclusion, far from the noise of civilization. The six of them, Emma, Jake, Sarah, Mike, Lauren, and Chris, had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was a chance to disconnect, to bond, and to enjoy the simplicity of nature. But as they sat around the crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, something felt off. Emma was the first to notice it. She paused mid-sentence, her brow furrowing as she tilted her head to listen. The others followed her gaze, their laughter dying down as they realized what was missing. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Jake replied, his tone light, but his eyes darting nervously around the campsite. "Exactly," Emma said. "Nothing. No wind, no animals, no insects. It's like everything just stopped." The group fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The forest, which had been so alive just moments ago, was now eerily still. The fire crackled and popped, but even that sound seemed muted, as if the silence was pressing in on them, suffocating. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Animals go quiet sometimes, right?" "Yeah, but not like this," Sarah said, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "It's too quiet. It's like the forest is holding its breath." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the firelight casting long shadows across their faces. The silence was oppressive, a tangible presence that made the air feel heavy and thick. They tried to shake it off, to convince themselves that it was nothing, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of their minds. And then they heard it, a distant, ragged breathing, faint but unmistakable. It was slow and labored, as if whatever was making the sound was struggling to draw air into its lungs. The sound sent a chill down Emma's spine, and she felt her heart begin to race. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded, their faces pale. The breathing was coming from somewhere in the darkness, beyond the circle of firelight. It wasn't one of them. They were all accounted for, sitting close together around the fire. This was something else. "Maybe it's an animal," Chris suggested, though his voice was shaky. "A wounded deer or something." "Deer don't sound like that," Lauren said, her eyes wide with fear. "That sounds human." The group fell silent again, the only sound the ragged breathing that seemed to be growing louder, closer. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. It didn't sound like any animal she had ever encountered, but the idea that it could be a person out here, in the middle of nowhere, was even more terrifying. "Maybe we should go check it out," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "If someone's hurt, we should help them." "No way," Sarah said, shaking her head vehemently. "We don't even know what that is. It could be dangerous." "But what if it's not?" Jake argued. "What if someone's out there, hurt and alone? We can't just ignore it." The group was divided, their fear warring with their sense of responsibility. Emma felt torn. The rational part of her mind told her to stay put, to wait until morning when they could see what they were dealing with. But another part of her, the part that couldn't ignore the sound of someone or something in distress, urged her to act. "Let's just take a look," Emma said finally, her voice trembling. "We'll stay together, and if it's something dangerous, we'll run back to the campsite. But we can't just sit here and do nothing." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They grabbed flashlights and pocket knives, their hands shaking as they prepared to venture into the darkness. The firelight seemed to shrink behind them as they stepped away from the safety of the campsite, the shadows closing in around them. The breathing grew louder as they moved deeper into the forest, the sound guiding them like a macabre beacon. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting eerie shapes in the beam of their flashlights. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was so complete that it felt like they were walking through a vacuum. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing through the trees. "Is someone there?" There was no response, only the steady, ragged breathing that seemed to be coming from just ahead. The group moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves on the forest floor. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She wanted to turn back, to run as far away from this place as she could, but something compelled her to keep going. And then they saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness, barely visible in the beam of their flashlights, but as they drew closer, the details became clearer. It was a figure, hunched over and motionless, its back to them. The ragged breathing was coming from it, each inhale a labored gasp, each exhale a shuddering wheeze. "Hey," Jake called out again, his voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their fear mounting with each passing second. Emma's flashlight trembled in her hand as she took a step closer, the beam of light illuminating the figure more clearly. It was a man, or at least it had once been a man. His clothes were tattered and stained, hanging loosely from his emaciated frame. His skin was pale and sickly, stretched tight over his bones, and his hair was matted and greasy. But it was his face that made Emma's blood run cold. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead with a vacant, lifeless gaze. His mouth hung open, revealing broken, yellowed teeth, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. But the most horrifying thing was the way he was breathing. Each breath was a struggle, as if his lungs were filled with something thick and heavy, and his chest heaved with the effort. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "What the hell is wrong with him?" The man didn't seem to notice them, didn't react to their presence at all. He just stood there, breathing in that awful, ragged way, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, his voice tight with fear. "Now!" But before they could move, the man's head snapped around, his lifeless eyes locking onto Emma's. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as he took a step toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Emma's arm and pulling her back. The group turned and bolted, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran through the forest. The man's ragged breathing followed them, growing louder and more frantic as he gave chase. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her legs burning as she pushed herself to run faster. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at their clothes and skin as they fled. "Back to the campsite!" Mike yelled, his voice barely audible over the sound of their pounding footsteps. But when they reached the clearing where their campsite should have been, it was gone. The fire, the tents, their supplies, everything had vanished as if it had never existed. The group skidded to a halt, their flashlights sweeping the empty clearing in disbelief. "What the hell?" Lauren gasped, her voice trembling. "Where is everything?" The ragged breathing was closer now, just beyond the edge of the clearing. The group huddled together, their fear palpable as they realized they were trapped. The man stepped into the clearing, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes fixed on them with a hunger that made Emma's stomach churn. "Stay back," Jake shouted, brandishing his pocket knife, though his hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold it. The man didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice the knife. He just kept coming, his breathing growing louder and more erratic with each step. Emma's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then, just as the man was about to reach them, the forest came alive again. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of rustling leaves, chirping crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. The man froze, his head snapping around as if he was listening to something only he could hear. And then, without warning, he turned and ran, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he had appeared. The group stood there, stunned and trembling, as the forest returned to its normal state. The silence was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of nature, but the fear remained, lingering in the air like a bad dream. "What the hell just happened?" Chris asked, his voice shaking. No one had an answer. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, their minds struggling to process what they had just experienced. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "We need to get out of here." she said, her voice firm despite the fear that still gripped her. Now! The others nodded, their faces pale and drawn. They gathered what little they had left and began to make their way back to the trail, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The forest seemed different now, the trees more menacing, the shadows deeper. Every sound made them jump, every rustle of leaves sending a fresh wave of fear through their bodies. It took them hours to find their way back to the trail, and by the time they reached the parking lot, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. They piled into their cars, their hands still shaking, their minds still reeling from the night's events. As they drove away from the forest, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the silent woods, standing tall and still, as if nothing had happened. But Emma knew better. The forest had shown them something dark and terrifying, and she knew that it would stay with her for the rest of her life. The silent woods were no longer just a place of beauty and peace. They were a place of nightmares, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred, and where the darkness held secrets that were better left undisturbed. And as they drove away, the ragged breathing echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder that some things were better left unseen. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Thick fog clung to the trees, swallowing the trail and muffling the sound of the group's footsteps. Mia, Jake, Sarah, Ryan, and Chris had set out on an early morning hike, eager to enjoy the crisp autumn air. But now the fog felt oppressive, like a living thing. "This is creepy," Mia muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. "I can't see anything." "It'll clear up," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. He led the group, GPS in hand, but even he seemed uneasy. The trail markers were barely visible, and the fog made everything look the same. Then they saw him. A man stood just off the trail, perfectly still, his back to them. He was tall, wearing a long, dark coat that hung loosely on his frame. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. The fog swirled around him, making him seem almost ghostly. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice wavering. The man didn't move. "Let's just go," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. They walked past him, giving him a wide berth. As they did, Mia glanced at him. His face was obscured, but she could feel his eyes on her. A shiver ran down her spine. Minutes later, Ryan stopped. "What the hell?" he muttered. The man was there again, standing in the middle of the trail, facing them this time. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were dark and hollow. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. "How did he get in front of us?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Jake said, gripping the GPS tighter. "Let's go back." They turned around, but after a few minutes, they saw him again, blocking the trail. "This isn't possible," Ryan said, panic rising in his voice. "We'll go around him," Chris said, stepping off the trail. They pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching at their faces. When they finally stumbled back onto the trail, the man was gone. But their relief didn't last. No matter which direction they went, he was there, always watching, always silent. By the time they made it back to their campsite, the fog had lifted. The man was nowhere to be seen. That night, as the fog rolled in again, Mia zipped up her tent and froze. Outside, deep footprints led straight to her door. Her heart pounded as she peered out. The fog was too thick to see anything, but she could feel him, watching, waiting. "Guys," she called out, her voice trembling. No one answered. The campsite was silent. Mia zipped the tent back up and crawled into her sleeping bag, pulling it tight around her. She told herself it was nothing, but deep down, she knew the truth. The man in the fog was real, and he was here. The next morning, the fog was gone. The group packed up in silence, eager to leave. As they reached the parking lot, Mia glanced back at the trail. There he was, standing at the edge of the trees, his hollow eyes fixed on hers. And then he was gone. Mia turned away, her heart racing. She didn't know who or what the man in the fog was, but she knew one thing for certain. He would be waiting for them the next time they ventured into the woods. You have listened, but the echoes never stop. They follow you in the silence, in the dark, in the places you fear to look. Like, subscribe, and stay in the shadows.